Hey everyone, so thank you so much for coming to this week's Cyber Lab. Just a reminder, we've changed the structure of the announcements. We will do announcements in groups, so we'll just jump straight into talks right now. And so I'd like to introduce Professor Liz, who is going to give a really cool talk. So take it away, Liz.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for hosting me. I know I was supposed to give a talk, I think, last week, and I couldn't make it because I was hit with food poisoning. You did not want me in that state. So I'm happy that we're able to kind of do it this week. So yeah, I'm Liz. I'm here. I'm a professor at UCLA. I just started July 1st. I was actually finishing my PhD at Stanford right before that. So I'm fresh here at UCLA. I did my undergraduate actually at UC San Diego. So it's kind of the sister school right below here. And it's been great to be back at a UC. So I love it. And today, so I was talking with some people at CyberLab and we were talking about which the topic to talk about. Because I lead a lab on security and networking. We do a lot of internet scanning stuff. And so the topic that we arrived on was about understanding attacks against cloud-hosted services. So that's going to be the work that I primarily focus on today. This is joint work with people that I did back when I was a PhD student at Stanford. So as you can kind of see, most people here have now evolved to the next steps in their professional journey. So now I'm here at UCLA. Amanda Tran was a master's student who worked with me at Stanford, and she is now my PhD student here. So we are continuing to work and publish together. So it's been awesome. And then Michaelis, he was a collaborator of ours who was at Merit Network. This is this kind of educational network that is at University of Michigan, and now he works at Akamai. Aurora, she was a postdoc in our lab visiting Stanford and is now faculty at CISPA, and Zakir, who is my PhD advisor at Stanford. So the way this talk's going to go is I'm going to broadly get us all on the same page about the internet and internet attacks and the IP address system, just for us to all get familiar and acquainted with it. And then I'll kind of dive a bit deeper into the actual research work that we've been doing. And I'll be keeping tabs on time just to make sure we don't go too over. So I think by when should I be done with this talk? 6:30, 6:40, 6:30. Okay, cool. Yeah, so we'll see how far we get. And then, yeah, okay, cool. So let's get started. So the internet. So the internet, just more broadly, if we think about it, it's composed of many different constituents. We first have the networks that deliver data to and from different parts of the world. And those networks can be up in space, satellite networks, which is also an area that my lab studies. Then they can also, for example, be underwater cables. And then we have the devices that we're connecting using the network. So the devices, they can be, for example, these routers that decide where to route data to and from. And they can also be the devices that are actually hosting data or hosting, for example, the web pages that both you and I browse on the internet. And then we also have the users, right? We have you and me, the users, and also the kind of abusers or the attackers of the internet. And so in general, my work provides a visibility into each of these different components. So we have different projects to study networks and devices and the users. And so when we kind of think more about devices, because these are often what are being attacked. So we said that we have, right, on the internet, a lot of servers and a lot of routers. But what's interesting is there's also weird kind of devices, if you think about on the internet, such as security cameras that are connected, printers, even water storage supply towers. And unfortunately, these devices are unintentionally publicly accessible on the internet. And that is what a lot of research has found up until today. And unsurprisingly, attackers are finding all of these devices and they're abusing these internet exposed devices. They're attacking them essentially. And this is what happened, for example, in 2016, when hackers essentially were able to take over a bunch of IoT devices. We consider routers, security cameras, printers, IoT devices, and they were able to have them all work together to orchestrate a denial of service attack, or essentially altogether send traffic towards particular destinations, such that major websites across the US were no longer accessible because they were overwhelmed by the traffic that all of these devices were sending. And so this is just an example of an attack where attackers are actually taking over these devices. And actually earlier last year, we saw that water utilities started being attacked. So at the beginning, I hate to say beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what we found is that there was a hacker group that actually targeted water storage supply systems and then essentially left messages as you've been hacked. And they actually demonstrated a capability to be able to change the chemical composition of water in these particular rural towns. Now, there wasn't necessarily any evidence that the water was unsafe, but they had that capability. And this is all, again, because these devices are connected onto the public internet. And so this leads to this question of, well, why are operators simply not securing their devices, right? And part of the reason is operators often do not know that their devices are either publicly accessible on the internet in the first place, or that they're vulnerable to attack. And this is essentially exactly what happened in this water storage situation. They had no idea that it was publicly accessible on the internet. They knew there was an IP address assigned, but they didn't know anybody could take it or could access it. And they especially had no idea that it was vulnerable. And this is actually, I mean, there was no security involved. This wasn't like somebody broke some type of security layer because they didn't know it was on the internet. They just decided not to really put any security on top of it. And so kind of what my lab does and shows is that protecting the internet requires visibility into the devices, networks, and their users. So we actually have to see the problems before we're able to fix them. And visibility, though, while it's great and simple to say, is actually quite a challenging scientific problem. And part of the reason is because the internet is very large and sparse. So when we're talking about these devices, and as we're going to be talking about the cloud as well, we're going to be focusing on the IPv4 address space. So this is roughly 4.2 billion possible addresses that can span from 0 all the way to 255, up to 55, et cetera. And so a device can occupy one of any of these 4 billion addresses. And now for each address, a device can expose a service on a port, and the ports range from essentially port 0 to 65,535. And so what ends up happening is you have the IPv4 internet, which is this grid, and there are 280 trillion possible locations that a service or a vulnerable service can exist on the internet. And that is what we are faced with as researchers, essentially, to understand, well, what is the vulnerability of the internet and how does the internet even look in the first place? And so to detect services, to start actually studying these services, we use this methodology called internet scanning. And so internet scanning, right, it probes IP address and port pairs. So for example, if we want to find a vulnerable security camera on the internet that might be running Telnet, which is a protocol that has authentication but isn't encrypted that operators like to use to manage devices remotely, then an internet scanning system would probe a particular IP in that port and scan for that particular application. And so then there becomes this, again, scientific question of, well, how do scanning systems know where to find these services in the 280 trillion possible locations? And internet scanning systems, they can't just probe every single location. Unfortunately, if you were to take one of the fastest scanning systems that we have, it's called ZMAP, it would take roughly 5.5 years to probe every single location on the internet. And no researcher has really done that because by the time you're done with the scan, everything that you discovered at the beginning is 5.5 years old. And so we have these standards in the networking community that attempt to organize where to host protocols. So for example, port 23, which is the port that we decided to use, is assigned to host the Telnet protocol that I mentioned, which operators like to use to access their devices. And so as a result, it's very common if you're studying Telnet to scan every IP address on the particular assigned port, and that takes roughly 1 hour. So that's actually very tractable. And so internet scanning systems do that for case studies. But what my previous research has shown, and what we now all know in the security community, is the majority of services are actually non-compliant. So even though we have standards about where devices should be, in reality, operators don't follow those standards. And so, for example, there was a piece of work that showed that 95% of Telnet is simply not on its assigned port 23. And so now we're kind of back to the beginning of this visibility issue, right? We had this large address space. We kind of tried to organize it. We didn't try to organize it to make security research easier, but we just wanted to organize the internet. But as a result, what ended up happening is nobody was following those standards, and now that's made everything a mess and also has made the science harder. And so what this means is that actually prior to all of the work that my lab has done, existing internet scanning systems were missing the majority of devices. So for example, if you were studying Telnet, just scanning the particular port, then you would miss the majority of everything else. And this goes back to this visibility issue, right? Like, why is visibility important, and why does the lab focus on visibility and problems? Because if you're only seeing 5% of the ecosystem, you have no idea what else is vulnerable, what those water storage towers, where they are, and how easy they are to take over. And to complicate matters, although this is not going to show up in this particular work, but internet service location constantly changes, right? We have this notion, for example, of DHCP churn, where devices get reassigned IP addresses. And so what this means is that when you finally discovered, for example, on a particular IP on port, a vulnerable security camera, within an hour, a day, a week, its address may have changed. And the problem starts from the beginning of, well, now, how do you find that particular vulnerable device? Because its address is no longer its own. And so this is essentially kind of giving you a taste of this messy problem of visibility on the internet. And so my work, actually, this was from a year ago. By now, there are more papers, but just to give you broadly a sense of like what the lab does, it provides visibility to many different ecosystems. So we have the IPv4 address ecosystem, which a lot of my introduction was focusing on that. Then we have the cloud. Sometimes that is a subset of the IPv4 address ecosystem, which we'll get to in the rest of this talk. But sometimes it's also, for example, cloud storage, which, for example, if you guys are familiar with S3 buckets, those have their own types of addresses that are outside of the internet, their own domain spaces. That search space is trillions of times larger than the IPv6 address space, which is trillions of times larger, even more than the IPv4 address space, which we just talked about. So these are enormous search spaces. We've also been doing work on satellites and understanding, getting visibility into that network, specifically Starlink, because it's very under wraps. And so we haven't really been exploring it from a security perspective, but more from how does that network work, because there's no information available. And the domain name system also is a particular application that we've explored. And so today we'll focus on this particular paper, which if you later Google like the title, it's like 12 pages long, Understanding Attacks Against Cloud-Hosted Services. This is presented at the Internet Measurement Conference, which I will be flying to on Friday. It's in Madrid this year, next week. Okay, so kind of now let's start focusing more on the cloud. So there's hundreds of academic works that study attacker behavior by analyzing unsolicited traffic targeting networks. So this whole internet scanning thing that I say we researchers do to find devices, attackers are doing the same thing. And now there's this big ethical question that we can talk about later about, well, how do we deal with the fact that all these kind of improvements that we're doing, attackers are using them as well. But the reality is attackers are smart and they're developing their own tools as well. So they send traffic. And so we study a lot of this traffic by kind of analyzing. We take a piece of the address space and we say, okay, what traffic is destined towards it and which of that is attacker traffic. Now, as it turns out, prior to this work, and I mean, it's still true today, we severely understudy cloud networks. So there's a lot of research being done in academic networks because academia is often doing this research. And now, so we found that we severely, don't study the cloud, but it's kind of strange because today the majority of IPv4 and IPv6 services are actually hosted in the cloud. So the majority, if, for example, attacks are uniformly distributed, the majority are hitting cloud. And so there's this question of, well, do we understand attacks against cloud-hosted services? And do we know how to best protect the majority of services? And I'm going to show you that the answer is no. Yeah. So the cloud is essentially pieces of rented address space. Yeah, so it's like Amazon, Google, essentially those operate clouds of rented address space where you can go and spin up like a server, a virtual machine, and they'll give you an IP, and then you can kind of go do your own thing. Yeah. Yeah. So essentially, like for example, UCLA has its own IP address space that it owns. And so, for example, if I wanted to study unsolicited traffic, what's easiest for me as an academic is to analyze the traffic that hits the IP addresses that UCLA owns. And so as a result, my perspective and my visibility would be just, attackers that target UCLA or maybe more broadly universities, but not necessarily what they would target for clouds. Yeah. No, it's just more convenient often. And like we studied the cloud, but it's just kind of oftentimes academic, kind of the resources that you have right in front of you are more convenient to study.
So with the IP addresses that like, let's say like we like rent out, or like, is it like a continuous chunk in like that ports?
So it's across all ports, and then it's usually like contiguous chunks within the IP address space. That's the simple answer. Okay. Cool. So we're going to talk a bit more about like the cloud and its unique ecosystem with interesting security properties. So the cloud, right, as I said, is a rented space of IP address space that often like Google or Amazon are providing, or Microsoft. And an interesting thing about the services on the cloud is they're often exposed to internet service search engines. So here I've taken a screenshot from an internet service search engine that I work really closely with called Census. And what they do is they do their own scanning. So Census is a company that does its own scanning, and it provides a service to researchers and also businesses of on the internet, what are the IP addresses and what are the ports that they've responded on. And so this is really useful, for example, for companies to be able to figure out what assets they might have publicly exposed on the internet, and also very useful for researchers, rather than everybody running their own scans all the time, to essentially use a database of scans and preserve bandwidth on the internet. And so this exists with any real service that is hosted, for example, any real service on the internet, and especially the cloud. And kind of going to this recycled nature of the cloud. So, there's IP addresses that all, for example, a cloud like Amazon or Google owns. And at a particular moment in time, a fraction of those IP address space would be rented by a user or a user. And for example, on IP1, at one particular time, maybe there's a SSH protocol that's running on it, which will allow a user to be able to have access to a server. And maybe the SSH protocol stays, but maybe in this IP address, there was a vulnerable version of the SSH protocol. So for example, one that didn't require a password. And maybe attackers actually saw that before, and they were able to abuse it. And then maybe later, the user, for example, protects their SSH, they add a password. But in this particular case, the attackers themselves now have knowledge that at that particular IP address, there was a vulnerable service before. And maybe the hypothesis is that in this recycled address space, certain IP addresses become bigger targets for attackers over time, because they themselves have learned that this IP on this particular port has had vulnerabilities before. And in a recycled address space, this might be more likely to occur than, for example, in academia on IP addresses where they get assigned to a particular lab server, and that lab server stays there for 15 years and nothing changes. Another interesting thing about the cloud is there's a lot of geographic diversity. So for example, in the Amazon cloud, these dots represent all the data centers in Amazon. So there's a lot of it. I mean, they're just essentially almost everywhere. And what that means also is that we know that there's attackers also everywhere. And there's this interesting regional connection that was another hypothesis that we explored in the paper, which is, are attackers more likely to attack services that are near them? And again, this kind of interesting geographic dimension does not exist if you're studying one particular network in the world. And again, if we were only studying UCLA's network, we would essentially only be studying whatever is going on there and not the rest of the world. The cloud is also awesome because we as researchers can deploy servers all over the world, and as a result, can actually analyze the traffic that hits servers all over the world. Okay, so in this work, we were focusing on how our cloud hosted services attacked. And there were 4 questions that we went through, and we're not going to get through all 4 of them. Today, we're probably going to get to 1, maybe 2. So the first one was, how do attackers target the cloud compared to other network types? The second is, how do attackers target services on the internet that are posted on internet service search engines? Then how do attackers target recycled addresses, and how do attackers target different geographic regions? So these are essentially, we've been building up to all of these interesting kind of dimensions that the cloud introduces, and the work, which I can send these slides later to the group, but also the paper kind of goes into depth about all of these. And so we have a methodology broadly of how we did this. So we studied network scans targeting 8 different networks. We had the cloud, education networks, and telescopes. So for the cloud, we spun up these interactive honeypots. So essentially, these are servers that mimic vulnerable servers in order to attract attacks towards them. And then it logs different types of interactions or attacks that we might have. And so we spun up these honeypots across 830 different IPs across all of these different cloud providers. That also gives you a sense of, and this is like, cloud providers these days. But the big one is like Amazon and the others. Then we also, in order to be able to compare our results, we needed a comparison point. We spun up interactive honeypots in education networks, so within the Stanford IP address range, and also Merit, which is affiliated with University of Michigan. And this was in order to be able to actually make claims about the cloud compared to something else. And then we also monitored a network telescope. So I'll get into a moment about what a network telescope is, but this network telescope was 475,000 IP addresses large. And we spun up honeypots across many different countries in the cloud, because that's easy to do. Stanford and University of Michigan are in the US, and this telescope is actually hosted by Merit, so it's also in the US. And then we ran, in order for scientific rigor, we ran experiments across the first week of July across 3 different years to compare and contrast the times. So thinking about like honeypot and the way one sets up a honeypot and analyzes the honeypot. So one way that we need to define an attack. What does it mean for a honeypot or server to be attacked? And so one of the ways we defined it is if someone is trying to log in or bypass authentication. So for example, in the SSH or Telnet protocols, you have this like login and then password. And so if you're able to log that somebody's actually attempting a password, then we consider that an attack. The reason why we actually had to define this, what an attack is, why we couldn't just say, oh, any type of unsolicited scan is probably an attack, is because researchers are scanning, census is scanning. There's a lot of good people scanning to understand the internet. So we kind of have to add this extra kind of standard to what do we think is an actual attack. And critically, when researchers and security companies scan, legally, we are not allowed to bypass authentication. Otherwise, we break the law. So you'll never see that from any ethical researcher. Then there's other protocols like HTTP, which is what hosts a lot of the web content. And that doesn't have an authentication, right? If you go to NewYorkTimes.com, like it's just going to let you go there. So how do you know that a server that's hosting HTTP is being attacked? Because we do see that. And for that, we were looking for packets or commands that alter the state of the service. So this is an example where it's sending a request, an HTTP request, which when we access web content, our requests do look like that. We send GET requests. This is a POST request. And in there, there's this script that's embedded. So this Java script that's trying to essentially like execute something on the server. And so what this means, this is unsolicited and it's altering the state of that particular server. So we consider that an attack. Okay, so for the sake of time, we're just going to go through the first question, which is how do attackers target the cloud compared to other network types? And so I mentioned this thing called network telescopes, which are heavily used in the internet scanning academic community. So what it is it's a large swath, so hundreds of thousands of IP addresses that are unused. So they don't host any real services, and they're simply observing the traffic that targets them. And so the idea is that if attackers don't know that these IP addresses belong to a telescope, then they'll send traffic towards them as well as traffic towards any other IP addresses while they're trying to find vulnerable services. And so this idea, since there are no real services that live in those IP addresses, any service that gets scanned there presumably is unsolicited and likely due to attacker traffic. Academics generally know it to avoid these network telescopes. But so this is kind of this loose assumption that, okay, a lot of that must be attacker traffic. And there's like 350 papers that used one particular network telescope alone. And so you have all these papers that are using these telescopes. They're not hosting any real services. And so one of the questions that we decided to ask is, are clouds and telescopes targeted by the same IPs? And so we had to do a bit of math here, which was, we were looking at the set of IPs that target the cloud. We wanted to know what fraction of them that target the cloud also targeted the telescope. So the idea is that the higher the overlap in IPs, the less the discrimination. And then the lower the overlap, that means that there are IPs in the cloud that are not targeting the telescope, and therefore we have different visibility. And so this is how the numbers look. So in 422, which is the signs, the SSH protocol that attackers love to break into, only 13% of the IPs that target the cloud also target as these telescopes that over 300 academic papers relied on. And we saw that overall, it was quite a low percentage. 480 was a bit better, but still. So what this meant is that the visibility of the academic community in terms of attacks does not translate towards the attacks that target real services today, especially in the cloud. And we did the same thing with comparing the university attacks to the cloud. And what we saw there is that the scanners do not avoid networks with real services. So here the overlap was actually a lot higher because education networks do actually host real services, although it's not 100%. So you still see some attackers targeting the cloud that don't target the academic networks, but the telescope one is even worse. And so we compared different attempted usernames and passwords and payloads and found that there was a lot of overlap here and very little overlap there. Something funny that we found is the Mirai botnet, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, but this is essentially one of the botnets that took over a bunch of devices, IoT devices on the internet. What we found is that still today scans port 23 a lot, and it scans so much of port 23, and it scans it so naively that it scans the telescope about as aggressively as the cloud. So the telescope sees the Mirai botnet quite well, but if you're looking at non-botnet attacker traffic, then there's very low overlap. And so the takeaway here was that we can't assume that telescopes capture the scans and attacks that target the cloud. And kind of and that was more of the takeaway for people in the audience when I was giving the talk who are using telescopes as a part of their research. But I think for you guys, one of the takeaways here is, again, this theme of visibility and security and how we observe attacks and what biases we create when we're observing them, and kind of thinking about how can we eliminate these biases? What do we actually not see in the security world, given our perspective? And then, we had a follow-up study about our internet service search engines or recycled addresses to blame. And kind of, I'm going to give you just like the answers as opposed to the methodology. So we set up all of these essentially more sophisticated honeypots to figure out, do internet service search engines increase attacks, right? You have these IPs and ports listed on these service search engines. Are attackers actually reading these service search engines? And the answer was yes. So essentially across different protocols, we found that if you were on an internet service search engine, your service, you were like up to 5.8 times more likely to be attacked. And then we looked at like recycled addresses, again, deployed these honeypots where we ensured that some had services, some didn't. And we found that addresses that were recycled were a lot more likely to experience attacks. And that, we should consider the IP addresses history when analyzing. And then we were also developed this methodology to understand how do attackers target different geographic regions. We did this kind of chi-squared methodology. So it's the statistical methodology for comparing distributions and whether they're different. And we kind of had this like methodology that we describe in the paper. And we found overall that attackers target the Asia Pacific region more uniquely than other regions in the world. And that was interesting because the Asia Pacific usually is understudied. And that's not kind of a vantage point that we often look at. And so that was, yeah, again, another example of visibility and what it can show. And then kind of the takeaway here, also beyond just the visibility theme, is we need to think about how we can adapt to attacker selectivity. So we often, as academics, are studying attackers, and we often make assumptions that attackers don't know what we know, but attackers are actually quite intelligent. They don't necessarily follow our research to the T, but they're kind of doing a lot of great things themselves. And so kind of as the takeaways from this work, at least what we saw is like attackers frequently avoid telescopes. So we need to use different types of networks to validate results. Attackers use internet service search engines. And this was something that people hadn't thought about before. So we need to kind of, when we're developing experiments, essentially take that into account. And attackers discriminate amongst different geographic regions. And so we need to take that all into account. And so as a part of this work, a lot of times we open source data that we collect. And so there's kind of a link there to some of the data that was used in this work. But yeah, and so that's essentially, but that's the end of this talk. So yeah, hopefully kind of we're able to find at least one thing interesting in this. So any other questions or point of discussion before? Yeah.
What are some of the things you're looking for?
Yeah, so this is tough when you just take a regular IP address and you're like, how do I know, what was on there? So a lot of the address space we used was actually the one that we had owned as a part of the lab at Stanford. And we knew ourselves that we were owners of this IP address for the past 6 years, and we hadn't hosted anything on it. So that was great, essentially ground truth to compare against. Now you can also use the scanning search engines that attackers are using to find vulnerable services. They often provide a history of services that the engine itself has found on the IP over the years. And so we could also use that as a proxy for understanding, okay, this IP over the years, according to the search engine, has had these particular services. Now, the search engines, they scan a lot, they use a lot of bandwidth, but they also don't see everything